All right, welcome back to the Aristotle Show. We're still in the politics. We are still in book 1, and we are now in chapter 3. So in chapter 3, Aristotle, again, it's all about looking at the fundamental nature of the polis by his method of analysis. In other words, looking at the smallest parts. So the fundamental composite of the polis, that is, remember the polis is this articulated hierarchical organic kind of whole in which the human being can find, namely the Athenian male can find his true happiness, his eudaimonia. But the fundamental, sort of the basic unit in many ways, the fundamental composite, right? Not individual, but composite. The fundamental composite of the polis or the city really is the household. So that's sort of the ground, like and it's the standard thing when we hear that the family is the basic unit of society. That's Aristotle's position. So it's a pretty standard one. We hear it a lot, and for him, he takes it as a natural unit. So remember, everything in here that Aristotle's talking about, he thinks is more or less decreed by nature. These are natural structures. Now, his main question, of course, because he is dealing with the whole thing about a polis, or remember, that's you can think of that as a city, or sometimes translated as state, a community. The main question is, how should the polis, how should the city be managed? That's ultimately what he's after in his investigations into politics. And as I said, this entire treatise is sort of kind of put together in an odd way. So he doesn't give one clear answer to that. But in this asking this question, he says, well, if you want to know about how the city should be managed, before answering this question, we must answer a different question, namely, how should a household be managed? So for book 1, the rest of it really, he's talking about running a household. So all the discussions that Aristotle's involved in here, as I mentioned in the previous discussions on slavery, he's talking about a small, more or less, group of people, a family, man, woman, in Aristotle's view, some slaves and children. So this would be kind of a small operation. So how should you run this small operation? Well, in the household, Aristotle says, and based on, that there's different individuals in it that are paired and relate to each other in a variety of ways, he says there's really 3 orders of management. There's the mastery rule, and we remember Aristotle has slaves in the house, so master-slave, that kind of relationship. The marital one, the relationship between husbands and wives, and then the procreative one, parents and children. So these are basically management styles or techniques or whatnot. And Aristotle, remember, doesn't think there is sort of this science of management in the way that Plato said. Now, the other 4th one, if you like, is the art of acquisition. And that's an important one, too. Aristotle will talk a lot about the proper means of acquisition. So Aristotle says, well, we have to really start examining each of these. So these must be investigated, examined, in order to understand them in more detail than we do, as he says, at the present time. And again, he says that it's not the same thing to run a household or a village or all that. So there's not like a specific science where you can say the same thing applies to all. So running a city or a village is the same thing as running a household. He's always clear to make these kinds of distinctions. So again, when you're thinking especially about these kinds of relationships, Aristotle is talking about them in certain contexts. So that's a way to at least, of course, not agreeing with what he's saying, but just saying that you have to always take that into account so that you at least understand what Aristotle is after. Now, Aristotle, again, as I've pointed out, he thinks that this is given essentially by nature. This is natural. So this mastery rule is a natural thing. And Aristotle also realizes that this is controversial. in the sense that maybe not controversial in the way that it is now, but certainly in his time there were other people controversial in the sense that other people disagreed with this. That some have said, look, all this is just a question of human laws creating these things, and this is not natural, and that slavery is just something that is human created, it's artificial, held in place by force. And because it's held in place by force, it's an arrangement by force, it's going to be unjust. So Aristotle, he disputes that view. He thinks it's by nature, and nature does things for the best, right? So he now, if he thinks slavery is something natural, he's got to tell a story, try and convince you that somehow slavery is for the best. And we're not talking about just the best for the master, but it's got to be good for the slave too. So Aristotle has to tell a story why that entire relationship is for the best as opposed to some other kind of relationship. And that it's not, it may have to be enforced by certain means that humans will have to do, bring in some kind of force for it. But in and of itself, he wants to make the argument that slavery is just. Now, in upcoming chapters, in chapter 4, for instance, so in chapter 4, Aristotle is going to do what he typically does. He's going to look and ask, okay, well, what exactly do we mean? What is a slave? So what is the idea of a slave, or a definition? And then in chapter 5, he's going to look at the question of justice when it comes to slavery. Is it the case that you can have some kind of argument to show that it's just? And again, he needs it because nature has a sense of justice to it, and slavery is natural. So he's got to tell the story as to why those people who think slavery is something artificial and enforced and inherently unjust are wrong. Okay, so we'll have a look at that in the next video.